Hello, friends. It's Chapo.
It was instituted through the auspices of NATO itself once it was established, which is the defense treaty between all the European countries and the U.S. For mutual defense. And it was a network of stay-behind groups and weapons caches in the countries of Western Europe, which in the event of a Soviet invasion could be used to do guerrilla activities, to wage behind the frontline partisan warfare, ironically, like the Soviets had done after Operation Barbarossa. So that was the plan. That was the. I mean, there wasn't really a public face to it, but the self-conception of it was as a network of stay-behind caches, where there would be, say, in a cave or in an underground bunker somewhere, underneath a church, maybe there would be a bunch of machine guns, forged documents, cash, a lot of cash, explosives that could be used to create a sort of an instant guerrilla group. It's like Blue Apron for guerrillas, basically. And who is going to establish and then supervise this installation and maintenance of these weapons and stores and materials? Who better than two groups that collaborated deeply with the United States, specifically with the CIA, during World War II and after, the MAFIA in Italy and the ex-fascists, the former supporters of Mussolini. So the MAFIA during World War II was making deals with the U.S. government. Lucky Luciano, head of the American Mafia Commission, made a deal to be allowed out of prison in exchange for securing the ports of New York against saboteurs and strikers more importantly. And then he was deported to Italy after the war. But one of the first big tests of the popularity of the post-war communists in Western Europe was during the 1948 French elections, which the communists would be standing in, having been the domestic force most associated with overthrowing fascism was the Communist Party, bar none. Every other organization, from the church to the establishment politicians, I mean, the monarchy was so stained by its association with Mussolini that they overthrew it at the end of the war. So with the communists in this incredibly strong position to win this election, the CIA, the nascent CIA, when it was still the OSS and military intelligence, went through Italy dispensing massive amounts of money to local mafia chieftains to use to create political thugs to go crack heads at rallies and things like that, intimidate voters, stuff ballot boxes, illegal contributions to media and stuff, propaganda campaigns, a massive clandestine effort to defeat the communists at the ballot box, mostly carried out by local mafia guys. And lo and behold, it worked. The communists were staved off from power for then. But, of course, they were still going to be a threat. The post-war Communist Party were one of the main parties in Europe, or in Italy, so much so that almost immediately the Christian Democratic Party became a catch-all party for essentially everyone left of the communists, from anti-communist socialist types, social democrat types, to the softer former fascists. Basically, that was all one party because they had to defeat the communists, and so that is where Gladio comes in to help bolster that effort. And that was the mafia's connection to the American intelligence and make them a good network to use to carry out Gladio. And the other was the ex-fascists themselves, who the U.S. obviously preferring to these humbled fascists who sort of knew who was in charge now were much more useful and desirable to work with than the communists. So people high up in the paramilitary elements of the Italian fascist state, like black shirts and shit, they made deals, contacts with the American military occupation very quickly. Their connections come almost at the very end of the war, because the U.S., while it was everywhere it invaded Europe, it immediately started negotiating with high-level local Nazi leaders in an effort to get them to switch sides, basically. That was the preferred method of dealing with the local high command. That was what Alan Dulles was doing from his office in Switzerland, was trying to negotiate Nazis to say, basically, get rid of that Hitler character, and we will back you against the Soviets. It's always in the context of counterbalancing the Soviets. And what that meant was that there were a number of Nazis and who were at the end of the war protected by the U.S. and given sanctuary and eventually evacuated out of Europe ahead of investigators and ahead of justice, basically. And it was called a rat line. And a lot of it was coordinated with the Catholic Church because they had a huge interest in getting high-level members of the Ustasha, which was the Croatian Catholic fascist party that was so extreme that the Nazis actually told them to knock it off a little bit because they were creeping them out. They were really good Catholic boys, so a lot of them were smuggled out of Europe with the connivance of the Vatican diplomatic corps and the local fascists in Italy. So those two groups end up becoming the administrators of Gladio over the years. So to build up Gladio, you require bodies and people, and the people that ends up being are on the ground, these fascist thugs and mob guys. Higher up, you have elite members of society, and then the political class and the media class especially, who will talk about more how they formalized their relationships and then directed the thugs below them on what to do. So you need organizational structure and manpower, and then, of course, you need funding. And it must be noted that at the same time that the United States is establishing these connections with the mafia, both in Italy and in southern France, in the port cities of Marseille, the Corsican mafia was hired by the CIA to break strikes by communists in the immediate post-war period to beat back the same communist swells that were buffeting Italy. And those mobs, the mobs that the U.S. hired to help rig the election in Italy, and the mobs that they hired in France to break the strikes, became, in the post-war period, the preeminent heroin traffickers in the world, trafficking Turkish heroin through what the French Connection. Everyone remembers the movie. That's those guys. The guys from the French Connection are the ones we hired to break the strikes in Marseille after the war. And the Pizza Connection, which was another huge network of mob-controlled heroin distributors through pizza restaurants, that was from Italy. So, once again, this is a thing there. You cannot deny that the U.S. had the relationship with these mobs, and that at the same time they were doing these things for us, they were making all this money in heroin. There's no inherent... I can't necessarily tell you that I know for sure that the CIA was involved in the heroin trade carried out by these organizations. But I do know that clandestine operations require clandestine funding, because if people can't see where the money is going, because that defeats the entire purpose, which means you need black money. And there's one thing to skim from existing budgets, but it's much, much easier to grab from funds that are never accounted for in the first place. And there's no better place than that to find untraceable cash that can be put to any kind of use you want than the drug trade. And the third piece of the puzzle, you got the money, you got the manpower. How do you distribute it? You need money laundering. And we'll talk more about this later, but I'll just establish at this point that there were a number of institutions that were created in the post-war era to launder money, from drug deals to media outlets to clandestine terrorist organizations, to buy weapons with, to bribe politicians with. And a lot of that money during this period was laundered through banks associated with the Vatican. And that ended up being, the Vatican Bank ended up being the reason that we know any of this, because it was in the 80s. It was a scandal with the Vatican Bank that led to the discovery of everything that I'm going to talk about here. So we'll talk more about that. But that's the other functional element of Gladio as a machine. So getting back to those connected dudes who ran the thing, not the foot soldiers in the mob or the black shirts, but the guys who were making decisions. These are your social elite, who you'd expect, high-level military people, high-level members of the clergy, people in the political establishment, people in the media establishment, essentially the stakeholders of Italy's post-war Republican government. And the way they organize themselves so that they could have at least a public face and be able to operate in the halls of power, basically by tapping people and inducting them within their group, they created a secret society. And so they made a Masonic lodge that they called P2, which stands for Propaganda Due, which is Italian for two. Propaganda 2, which is the name of a very famous 19th century Italian Freemasonic lodge. And so this Freemasonic lodge became the place where people would be identified as part of the elite, approached, inducted, and then given the secrets to, and then given part of the administration of. The classic compartmentalized secret organization. And that was what coordinated and governed the actions of this organization. And it should be noted that there were proven to be a number of high-ranking Catholic prelates, including a number of cardinals, to be members of the P2 Lodge, which is directly in conflict with canon law, which strictly forbids any Catholic clergyman to be a member of the Masons. So whatever they were doing with Gladio was way more important to these guys than obeying the letter of the law when it came to, I don't know, God's word. And I should say that one of the members of this, when it was revealed, the members of this organization, one of them was an up-and-coming media go-getter named Silvio Berlusconi. So the 1948 election is a huge is the high tide for a while of Italian communism, and the tide breaks and rolls back a bit.